I'm Gab, he's Jules. Mutable weather, I think is fair to say, over West London. But Jules, you might say it's international break, nothing happened. No. There's a lot going on as we wait for the eagerly anticipated internationals this week. Obviously, the transfer window closed on Monday. We brought you news of some deals. We'll be talking about other deals. Isak was done, but that wasn't a surprise. Mark Gay fell apart. We'll be getting into that a little bit later. Johan Wissa moved.
Yeah.
I think Donnarumma moved. I think in terms of surprises in the end, there were not that many surprises perhaps, but there were some interesting backstories and stories that were kind of developing over time. The big headline to me, and it's a kind of a bit of a mystery, and I may be writing about this week, is the Premier League's net spend. We saw two things kind of in terms of macro trends, right? One is we saw a much higher volume of moves across Europe's big five leagues, not just in the Premier League, just more players coming in, more players coming out. And then we saw the Premier League's net spend this year reach 1.5 billion euros. Now, a year ago, it was about half that. And a year ago, it was kind of the lowest amount, if you adjust for inflation, since 2014, right? So some of us said, oh, look, Premier League clubs are being careful now with money, correction, blah, blah, blah. Now they're just spending it all. I try to explain it, but I have a theory. But why do you think they're all chucking so much money around all of a sudden?
I mean, I think big clubs had to strengthen or wanted to strengthen. Some were rebuilding their squad with new managers. So some spend a lot of money. If you just look at Arsenal, Liverpool, United, for example, just I think the three of them, maybe you had Spurs, that's $1 billion. Yeah. So I think this was clearly leading by some of the top clubs who wanted to get stronger or had to buy new players for new managers and things like that. But yeah, apart from that, I'm not really sure why.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I think when people look at people, we like to talk about, record this and record that. Obviously, I'm a big believer in net spend. I'm like that guy on Arsenal TV who says, don't talk about spend, talk about net spend, fella. But I also think the big clubs are the ones who move most of the money. And there's specific situations. Obviously, Liverpool spending nothing a year ago meant that they had they had spent some money on Federico Chiesa, but it meant that they had squirreled away kind of, a lot of nuts for the winter. Yeah. And obviously they blew it all this time. Yeah. Although their net spend, I think, was only the second or third highest.
Because they sold well.
In the Premier League. They did sell very well. And then in the case of Spurs and Manchester United, both of those, their net spend was about twice what it was last year. And then you can say new manager, hugely disappointing season. Yeah. That explains that. Arsenal, after a bunch of second place finishes, deciding to go all in, push all the chips in the middle to win now. Yeah. So I think it's a combination of those factors that inflated it this year. But I also think there's something else going on, which is it hasn't changed the fact that all these clubs, in terms of operating expenses, once you take transfers out, they all lose money. And some of these clubs then break even and not all of them. Brentford and Liverpool and one or two others. But Brighton, it's like 75. I think Brighton as well, operating expenses, they lost money. But they rely on player trading. And the thing about player trading isn't just because otherwise it becomes like a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme, right? It's also the accounting rules that actually encourage you to go and trade players and move them around and turn them into commodities. I think that's a big part of what we've seen. And what we've seen much more this year is something that was commonplace elsewhere maybe. A lot more bonuses, a lot more transfer fees, conditional on qualifying for the Champions League, reaching certain goals. And also these loan with obligation to buy, or loan with obligation to buy under certain conditions. These are things that Premier League clubs didn't really do in the past.
No, but I guess it helps you for your accounting because you sign him now, he's on loan, but then you delay the payment because of the obligation to buy next year. So it's almost like if you bought him next year, but you don't have to wait for next year, you can get him now, get the player now. What's interesting is you've got an obligation to buy that was before a fixed price. So regardless of what happened in the season, if the obligation to buy was 20 million, it was 20 million. Whether the guy won a treble or nothing or being relegated, that was the obligation to buy. Now, you also put bonuses or add-ons on the obligation to buy, so it can go up, like in the Nico Jackson deal. So I guess all clubs trying to find different things to make things more appealing for the selling club, maybe better for you as a buying club, and I think it's quite clever.
It's a lot of financial engineering, I think, which we've seen on Wall Street, people doing this kind of stuff, and I think now it's very much come into football, for better or for worse. I like to think most of our listeners understand the whole concept of amortization, because we've educated them over the years.
Yeah.
But essentially, when you spend a fee, like how much did Arsenal, what did they say they spent on Gyökeres?
I think 65.
Okay, let's say 65 million. So let's say he has a 5-year deal. I don't know if he does, but I think he does. So basically, the way clubs think about this is they think about this in terms of player cost, right? So they write down, they say, okay, this year Gyökeres is costing me 1/5 of that 65 million. So it's 13 million this year, 13 million next year, and so on. However, when they transfer a player out to another club, they, on their books, as if they're counting in terms of whether they made a profit or a loss, they do it based on the residual value. So 2 years from now, let's say his residual value on the books will have gone down by 26 million. 2 years at 13 million. So it would be 39 million. That means that if 2 years from now, if Gyökeres doesn't work out, Arsenal can transfer him for 39 million and they've broken even. Anything above that is gravy, is money. And that explains situations. To me, that explains a lot, because it explains one of the other trends that's going on is that we don't see players, we haven't seen this summer, maybe Trent Alexander-Arnold, although that was a free transfer, of course, and obviously Donnarumma. We don't really see the big club to big club transfer. Am I forgetting any other? I mean, you could argue Nico Jackson, maybe.
Yeah, I was going to say,
So, and again, I'm not disrespecting Newcastle here, Newcastle fans. Obviously, Alexander Isak moved, and Newcastle, a legit big club. But the big difference is Alexander Isak was still in his original deal, right? He had 3 years on the original deal when he came over for Real Sociedad. So he was not making a lot of money, certainly not making something in line with what he had achieved in the Premier League, right? And I think this is important because what we're seeing clubs being very willing to spend a lot of money on transfer fees, mostly for young players or players who are coming from clubs who don't pay high wages.
Yeah.
If you look again, Liverpool, they signed 2 guys from Bayer Leverkusen, a guy from Eintracht Frankfurt. If you look at Arsenal, Zubimendi from Real Sociedad, Gyökeres from Sporting, Norgard from Brentford, Hincapie from Bayer Leverkusen. These are all people who you can triple their wages. Unlike, for example, the Kai Havertz deal, when they got him. Kai Havertz, coming from Chelsea, he was on a lot of money. And when these players move, nobody takes a pay cut, right?
Yeah.
So, or Odegaard, obviously was a younger player, but there's a whole background there. He'd been at Real Madrid and whatever. So I think this is important because what we're seeing, and anecdotally speaking to clubs and agents and intermediaries, is there's an unwillingness, especially from Premier League clubs, to push the boat out on wages. We've touched upon this before. The fact that to this day, unless I'm forgetting somebody, other than Erling Haaland, I don't know what kind of numbers Donnarumma ended up with.
Pretty high. It's a big package.
Well, do you have a number?
I was given a number, but I could not. I only had one sources. But yeah, it's
Is it more than £400,000 a week or 20 million pounds a year?
No, but you're still in the bracket over the 300.
Okay, but that seems to me almost like a natural ceiling, right? That £400,000
that's what
a week.
Isak is on at Liverpool.
That the only player above that is Erling Haaland.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at it, if you go back a few years, the highest paid players in the Premier League were on around £350,000 a week, £375,000 a week. Someone, in fact, I think there's, Cristiano, obviously, when he came over the second time. So it's almost like clubs are being careful with their wages. Sometimes they're offering very long contract, like Chelsea does and whatever. And the reason I think that's important is they want to be able to then move the player if they need to. And as we've said, certainly, it's not just the top clubs, it's even the middling clubs in the Premier League. Their wages are so high that there's very few clubs that that can afford them if you want to move them on. So I think that's a trend. I'll be really curious to see what the data is on wages this time around. But do you know that in the most recent data available, so 22-23 to 23-24, wages in the Premier League actually fell, the cumulative wages, while revenue went up. There's also a new television deal that takes effect this year, which I don't think is a great deal at all because they're giving up much more inventory and so on. But it's still, and it's a 4-year deal rather than a 3-year deal, but it's still a 5% uptick. So all these things, I think, put together meant that this year there was more liquidity in it. And it's just been really interesting to me that clubs have kind of held the line. I've talked before about Vlahovic and Osimhen and how nobody in the Premier League would touch them. Why? Because they're on enormous wages.
Yeah.
I don't for a minute believe that, I don't think anybody believes that either of these guys is substantially worse than Matthias Cunha or Gyökeres or Brian Mbeumo. And yet, and they're roughly the same age. Vlahovic actually a little bit younger. And yet, in the end, nobody would go near them because of the wages. And the big advantage is that, again, if Cunha or Mbeumo or Gyökeres don't work out, they're a lot easier to shift than these other guys. So I think this is something that's going to annoy players' unions, right? Wages.
I mean, then you I don't know, if you're a player and you know you're not worth 400,000 a week, it's hard to demand 400,000 a week. So I think there's a lot of players in the Premier League right now who are very happy with their wages. If you get offered more, of course you take it. But I don't think any of those players would be unhappy with the wages.
I'm not suggesting to be unhappy. I'm suggesting that the Premier League clubs have decided, and this has been a trend that's been oncoming. I think Chelsea have slightly pioneered this.
Yeah.
In holding the line on salaries. And I think the main thing to remember with transfer fees is once you've commodified the players, once you've turned them into tradable assets as if they were pieces of machinery, which is the way our transfer market is set up, you can always profit off that. But wages are just a sunk cost, right? And they become more of a millstone, I think, around your neck. And other thing I thought was interesting, and maybe a guy who kind of epitomizes this, is Rasmus Hojlund. And he's kind of like the full package, right? United spent a lot of money on him. Doesn't do well for 2 years. And then, but because he's coming from Atalanta, he's not on a lot of money. I'm sure he probably tripled his wages at Manchester United, but they're still relatively affordable.
Yeah.
Napoli comes in, and this deal kind of has every element of what we've talked about, right? The bonuses and so on. So Napoli structured a deal with Hojlund where, not this contract, because this contract he's still on his United contract because officially he's on loan, but the new contract that he would get if his deal becomes permanent is heavily structured in terms of image rights, in terms of bonuses and whatever. So he can make roughly the same money, if not more, than what he made at United. But it's all conditional on performance. Yeah. And then on top of that, to kind of protect themselves, what Napoli did is they paid a high loan fee. That high loan fee to Manchester United, between that and Hojlund's wages for this season, United have sort of covered their amortization for this year. And then there's a condition where I think it's 40 odd million that they would pay, which would cover the rest of his amortization. So United don't lose money on Hojlund. Yeah. But then that's contingent on Napoli qualifying for the Champions League, so that Napoli from their end are saying, well, wait a minute, if we don't qualify for the Champions League, then we can't afford to make this deal permanent. So it's like we said, like there's this level of sophistication, and these guys are pretty much commodities at this stage.
Yeah, they are. I mean, the contract that Hojlund will get Napoli is the contract that every PSG player is on right now, that the club changed in the last 2.5 years. Really, Donnarumma was the only one left with the old kind of structured contract. And I think a lot of clubs are doing that. I mean, you mentioned Chelsea. I think they are pioneering a different approach to contract situation, whether it's the length and whether we agree or not with a 7-year contract, 8-year contract. It doesn't matter so much. It's just the way they want to do it to run their clubs. And I think that's, in a way, very admirable. Same for Napoli to do that. Even even for PSG with all the money they have, I think it's still good that they just don't just splash the money in a not thoughtful way. And I think it's good that clubs, and they have to anyway, because of all the financial restrictions that they can be under, to just think differently.
Yeah, I think it's. I agree with you. I think it's a symptom of the situation we're in. I just don't want people to look at this and kind of draw the conclusion that football, as a business, all of a sudden is suddenly sustainable because they're splashing cash around Europe. In the other 4 leagues, I think Serie A had the second highest. They had a net
1.2 billion spent.
Yeah, but their net spend in the end, 1.2 billion. So it's a lot of volume, but in the end, the net spend I think was around 70 odd million.
Yeah.
La Liga, I think around 44 million, and then Liga and the Bundesliga both actually making a profit on this. So they didn't even have a net spend.
Yeah.
So I find net spend interesting because it's a really bad way to calculate the underlying health, but it also tells you a lot about the movement of money right now. And final point, which I think is worth making, the Premier League's revenue last year was just only slightly less than the second and third highest grossing leagues, which are La Liga and the Bundesliga, put together. And I think that kind of tells you why the landscape is the way it is.